Hey everybody, welcome back. My name is Jeremy Lord. We are going through our third episode of the weekly creative challenges. So this is third of four. For those of you guys who are just joining us through your Adobe ID, make sure you ask some questions, follow along as well. That's the whole point of these creative challenges. Just to give you guys a little bit of a recap, what we've done in the past couple of weeks is we've taken a drawing that's just been scanned from a sketchbook without any of the bells and whistles, and we through Photoshop have gone through and kind of used the clone stamp, use a bunch of different effects to create a line work that will then be able to be used in Adobe Photoshop to paint underneath. And then last week we had a quick look at colors and this stage of the process where we're kind of got our drawing, it's all good to go, and we're ready sort of to put color in it. So we've kind of already put color, that was last week. And then this week we're going to look at shading. So if you have followed on all the way up to this point, then please make sure next week we will go through your submissions and give you guys some feedback on that, as well as your portfolios if you like. The link to that for you guys to submit is in the Adobe chat. So there's a submission form for you guys where you can upload a photo, give us your name, and we'll hopefully go through that next week. If you're just joining us now and you haven't actually gone through all this and you're wondering where the files are, they will also be a link in the chat for you guys to download these two files. So essentially what we've got is the actual drawing that we were looking at beforehand, and another paper texture that we used in order to kind of fix that drawing up, if you will. So make sure you guys download these, if you're going to follow along. And yeah, we'll just jump right in. So again, up to this point, we've looked at getting this drawing from a sketchbook into Photoshop, and then to put some colors essentially behind it using a multiply layer. So this is the layers as they stand now in Photoshop. So I've got my drawing, there's a layer mask on that. We covered that last week. Again, there will be replays available for all of you guys who are just joining in now. But yeah, today what we're going to look at is getting shading on this, because colors are great. We get a lot of contrast in, but it's still a little bit flat. So the light is really going to allow us to bring some volume into this. So we want a little bit of shading to make this pop. And there's a few different ways that we can do this today. So again, I'm just using a mouse for all of this. So you don't necessarily need a Wacom to do this. It will make your life a lot easier, but it's not an absolute requirement. So again, just to kind of break down where we're at here, we've got our drawing, which just looks like this. And we've got a little bit of kind of digital type on there, but the bulk of it is our drawing. And then underneath that, that's on a multiply layer. We've locked it. Underneath all of that, we've added in a whole bunch of colors on separate layers, which I've been really lazy and haven't named. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. Some of them are named and others are not. Naming your layers is a bit of a pain, but it'll save you a lot of trouble later on, especially if you're handing that file over to another designer or another creative. They will definitely not thank you if you've got like layer 1 copy 32. Not great. So we've gotten all of those all ready to go. So I've got a layer where there's a color for the kimono, the katana, the skin, the hair decorations, and this little kind of type cube down here. What you name your layers, how many layers you create is kind of up to you. Whatever your workflow is going to work the best, I guess. Too many layers is a bad thing, because then you have to micromanage. Not enough layers means that when the client will make the changes that they will invariably ask you for, you're kind of a little bit stuck. So there's a good sort of fine line there. What we've done as well is we've organized our layers to be nice and clean. So we've got all of our colors, in one group, and our drawing in another kind of on its own, right? So that's going to allow us to do kind of individual changes to each color, or do bulk changes to everything, which is what we're going to be wanting to do at this stage. So in traditional painting, what you would do is you would jump straight onto your skin layer, and we're going to use the eyedropper and eyedrop that color. Going to go into our color picker and just pick a darker version of that. This is really kind of very, medieval broad axe kind of approach to shading. And then I can literally, with my paintbrush, come in and paint some shading into there. But I might sort of, go over this kind of stuff, and it's not great. Also, if I decide that I want the shading from a different angle, I kind of have to redo that whole thing. So not necessarily the best way to go. It's fine if you're trying to work all on the same layer, then you're not really going to have a choice to do that. But it's not necessarily the approach you want to take on this. The main thing that we can do here is we can create a new layer on top of everything else, so within that group of colors, and call this shading. All right, and I'm going to go with black because black is just, that's your easy kind of shading. Shadows are almost never just that simple, where it's just a darker, blacker version, like you take a color and you mix black into it. But just for the sake of, simplicity, this is what we're going to do today. So I'm going to make that layer. I've selected my black and I'm going to fill it. So Option, Delete, and I've got that all good to go. And then I can drop the opacity down. So let's say we drop the opacity down to like 40%. Okay. Here you'll notice, by the way, just a little bit of sort of color and shading theory. One of the issues that we're going to have if we do just make black is I'm going to go in and just quickly jump ahead. I'll go back to what I'm doing in a sec, but you'll see what happens is on most of my colors, that black is okay, but on yellow and black kind of make this like baby poo kind of greeny color. It's not really great. So we're going to look at that a little bit later on. But black is, again, never really your best option for this kind of stuff. But we'll just use it for now. So what I've done here is I've applied a big kind of black panel on top of all of my layers, and I've dropped the opacity down. Then I've gone in and created a layer mask. Okay, so layer mask is going to allow me to erase without erasing. So we went through this last week with destructive versus non-destructive. And what you want is a non-destructive workflow. You want to not have to delete pixels, because then if you want them back, you have to recreate them. So we just want to hide them, essentially, right? So we're going to create a layer mask. And that layer mask is going to allow us to essentially hide pixels. So again, on a layer mask, anything that's black will hide, anything that's white will reveal. And then we're just going to paint. So I'm going to say that the light's going to come from like up here. Okay. I could decide, if I'm being really fancy, that actually I'm going to sort of bottom light her a little bit. That's going to take some sort of thinking in order for me to do the shading. So you know what? Let's be all we can be and do that. So I'm going to take the lighting from below and I'm going to light her up that way. So this at this stage is just kind of trying to think about how that light would hit her face. What are some of the sort of the volumes of the face? Where's that light going to be kind of hitting? It's almost, if you kind of want to think about it in this sense, it's almost like if you imagine that basically like it's snowing, but in reverse, right? All the snow is coming up from underneath, and wherever that kind of snow is going to reach a particular kind of volume, it's going to accumulate and give you a little bit more light, right? I don't know if that metaphor makes a lot of sense, but it does in my brain, so we're going to go with that. All right, so we're starting to see that light. Again, I'm using just a standard brush here. I don't have any pressure sensitivity here, so I'll have to sort of get in and make a smaller brush. If you are using a Wacom, that's why, or a drawing tablet, that's where you'll be able to use pressure sensitivity options and kind of do that. But again, we can kind of do it this way, or like we looked at last week, we can actually use a lasso tool, which will give us slightly sharper edges. Okay, so I'm going to make my selection like that, and then I'm going to fill with those colors. And so basically I'm just doing the same thing that I used to be doing with my brush, I'm just getting a little bit more precision going on. All right. Or I can do the same thing with my pen tool for like ultimate precision, but maybe a little bit more time consuming. So I can go in with my pen tool and do my shading like that. Pen tool's always a little bit funny to use the first time you do it, but it can be good if you definitely don't have a Wacom and you're looking for really smooth lines. Then pen tool is going to be your friend. And then we're going to right click and say make that into a selection. 0 pixels feather radius because we want it to be nice and clean, and hit return, and then fill that with our selection. So again, same thing that we went through last week. We're just looking at different ways of essentially painting, because that's what we're doing here. We're painting in the shading. So I'm going to stick to my lasso tool here, all right, and keep sort of adding in those colors. So this is also, again, the advantage of me. If I've messed up down here, I can go back in with my white and bring that back in, right? So I've actually got a whole bunch of control on what I'm doing here, and I don't have to be too careful. If for some reason I mess up and do this, I can just switch colors and paint that back out. All that black is still there. I'm not actually deleting any of it. Okay? So again, just kind of trying to think about where and how that light would hit. I'm doing this very, very crudely at this stage. I'd probably spend a little bit more time on this if I was a little bit more careful. But just to show you guys this kind of quick, rough technique of just put a black layer on top of everything, and then with a layer mask, we can come in and block out the lights that we want to block out. All right, so we're starting to see kind of some of the volume appearing here, and it's definitely giving it a little bit more depth. Okay, so that's for our kind of really crude way of doing things. The problem with this, obviously, is that I'm still going to have to paint all of this stuff out here because I want the background to be white, right? So I'm going to have to spend a little bit of time with this, blocking out that shape, which I've kind of already done. I want to reuse some of the pixels that I've already done in order to do that to it, right? So then I kind of want to think about a better way to do this. This way is still better than what I was doing before, where I'm picking that pink skin and getting a darker color of it and painting that in, because again, if I decide later on that I don't want the skin to be pink, I might have to repaint the shadows, and again, that's extra work. I don't want to have to do that, right? So what I'm going to actually do here is I'm going to delete this, and actually, yeah, you know what? I'm going to delete it again. What I'm going to do is I've got actually everything here is in a layer mask, in a group here that I can actually do stuff to. So I'm actually going to use an adjustment layer. That's going to mean that anything in that group here is going to be affected by that adjustment layer, but not the background. So I don't want that white to be affected by whatever I'm going to do, in this case, the shading. So I'm going to select that group, and I'm going to go down into my layer panel right here and select that little kind of half circle. And I'm going to go to the hue saturation slider. Okay. I could do this individually on each layer, but again, that's kind of destructive. I don't want to do that. I want to just do it as a whole and then be able to control that without having to sort of micromanage too much. So I'm going to drop the lightness, and you'll see that it looks like it's applying to the black. Okay. But if I then click this guy, you'll see that that's no longer the case. And I've done that wrong again for some reason. Here we go. Let's try that again. Nope. So, all right, what's happening here is I'm forgetting some of the basics of what I used to be doing. I need that hue saturation layer to be on top of the group, not inside the group. Otherwise, it's only going to apply to one of the layers in that group. I want it to apply to a whole bunch of layers in one group. So clicking that little guy down here means it goes from everything beneath that layer is currently being affected. So all of my colors and my background is being affected by that adjustment layer. I've purposely put all those colors into a group so that I can tell this guy only affect the group or the layer immediately beneath you. So what I've effectively done is I've saved myself a lot of time here and told Photoshop to do the work for me, which is great, right? That's what you want Photoshop to do. So now all I need to do is, with my layer mask, and all adjustment layers come with a layer mask, I can go back in again and paint those highlights where I needed them. But I don't have to worry about anything out here, right? Because that's an adjustment layer that's working for me in that way. So I can do that again quite roughly, and you'll see what I mean. The beauty of this is because this is an adjustment layer, it's basically waiting for color to appear underneath it to then be affected by the shading, right? And if that didn't make sense, which it probably didn't, is this. I'll finish a little bit more of the lighting in here and you'll see exactly what I mean in a sec. All right, that'll do for the time being. So we got a bit of an idea of where the light's kind of coming from. This, by the way, will be reused a little bit later on for us. So we've done the work once. We're going to use that work a bunch of different times because, again, we've done that layer mask now, so we can reuse it in a bunch of different ways. So that's going to come back and help us in a sec as well when I show you guys another way of doing this. But this is now affecting the layers underneath, which means that if I decide to change the color of the hair, so if I go in individually on that, I could go and put another adjustment layer on this and tell it to only affect the hair. But if I do that for every single layer, now I've got each layer now has an adjustment layer that's being affected. It starts to get a little bit micromanagey, right? So yes, Photoshop can save you a lot of time and a lot of effort, but at the same time, you're probably gonna have to think about, doing some of the work as well. Photoshop's great, but it still needs you to drive it, essentially. All right. So we're not going to do this. We're going to go in a little bit destructive and just do it smack bang on that layer. And we're going to change the color of the hair. And you'll notice that as I do that, the color of the shading also gets affected, right? So that shading that I created is now affecting, no matter what color you put underneath it, it will take on that shading value. If I decide to change all the colors in here as well, that will also be the case, right? We've got Vidang K, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, saying, what's the best option for shading, lasso or brush? I think it really depends what you're using. If you're using a mouse, I'd say probably the lasso, simply because, like I said, you'll be able to get these kind of sharp edges in there. Whereas if you're using a mouse with a brush, you're not going to be able to do that because there's no pressure sensitivity. So you're just going to get this long noodle of a shading, depending on the brush that you're using. Photoshop can be customized in order to do that, but you'll have to relinquish some of the control. You could, if you wanted to, get a sharp edge and you're really averse to using the lasso tool, you could then switch your colors and paint some of that back in. So you're basically faking the brush taper, okay? But again, that's double the work. You got to paint the brush and then undo the brush stroke a little bit as well. So lasso tool is probably going to be a little bit better. With that, if you had kind of too many coffees, you'll see this kind of shaky line. It's possible to try and sort of fix that. That's where your pen tool comes in. But I'd say the quickest, easiest one is probably the lasso tool, and you might just have to redo it a bunch of times. So yeah, let me undo all of that. And we're good to go. This, by the way, again, the light source was just arbitrary. I just decided to put it underneath because it makes it a little bit more dramatic and, made kind of like a demon geisha. So it makes sense that she's kind of bottom lit a little bit. But how you decide where the light source comes from is really entirely up to you. It just really depends on what you're going for in that illustration. Okay, so far we've looked at a couple of different ways to create the shading. This is probably the way that I would use the most. And as I said, I just made all those colors a little bit darker. But what we can kind of look at here is black is not necessarily the best way to go. I can actually make my shadows a little bit warmer or cooler depending on what I'm trying to do. So obviously I don't want to screw around with it too much, but I can just give a little bit more blue in the shadows or a little bit more warmth in the shadows to make it a little bit more natural, right? Like light isn't just black or white. Light is made up of a whole bunch of different colors. That's your color spectrum. So we want to kind of play around with that. Again, that's mostly just color theory. It really depends on what you're trying to go for, but you want to just give it a little bit, like if you can just not use black, you're always a little bit better off. Even if it's just like black with like 3% red in it, it's just going to feel a little bit more natural. So we're just going to go ahead and do that. And you'll see that the kind of the difference there is, you know, something just like this. And here it feels a little bit more kind of interesting, right? So that's all kind of working out well for me. But because I like to kind of work in manga style sometimes, I'm actually going to show you guys how to create a halftone shadow. So when you're working with mangas, if you're working with pen and paper, you'll find these transfer paper called deleter papers. There's a bunch of other brands as well that will actually allow you to have a halftone paper and then put it down onto the page and then cut it out where you don't want that shading to be. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to keep this mask, right? I'm going to make a new color, a new layer, sorry, and I'm going to drag that layer mask onto here because I want to reuse this. And I'm just going to hide, or you know what, I'm just going to delete it. And now I've got a layer here with a mask on it, but there's nothing on the layer, so the mask isn't actually doing anything, but I've just reused that mask because I've done the information once. I don't want to have to do it again, okay? So again, all I've done here is I've just dragged that mask onto that layer. That's it. So now that mask is applying to there. And I'm going to create a halftone paper. So I am going to, on my layer, I'm going to fill with black, and now you'll see my mask appearing. Okay, that's quite dramatic. Sometimes I think I might just kind of leave it there, but let's not for now. I'm going to turn that mask off just so I can see what I'm doing a little bit better. So how you turn off a mask, you'll notice that this one is turned off below here. It's got a big giant red X through it. If you click on the mask and hold down Shift, you'll turn that mask off. Okay? So we got black. I need this to be gray because what halftone paper does is it kind of emulates, lots of little black dots will give you the illusion of a kind of a gray shadow. We don't want it to just be black. So I'm going to go into my favorite little panel, my hue saturation panel, and I'm literally just going to go where it says lightness. I'm going to type 50. Okay, and I've done an exactly 50% gray. So that gray is smack bang halfway in between pure white and pure black. All right, I could have a darker gray if I wanted to. It really just, again, it depends on what size you're working at, what's your file size, because it'll kind of put the dots a little bit further apart. Depending on where you're at, but let's just stick with 50% gray. And then I'm going to go up to my filter panel. So in my menu, filter, and I'm going to go to pixelate and color halftone. All right, and it brings up this little panel. So the first one here will have a value that will kind of determine the size of the dots. So halftone paper is lots of little circles put closely together, giving the impression of like a gray, but you can still kind of see through it. So that's going to determine the size of those dots. We've got 4 channels here. They refer to CMYK, so cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, your key color. Because sometimes you'll see on kind of cheap newsprint, you'll see these little rosettes appear, and that's kind of the same thing happening here. We don't want that. We only want one channel. We just want the black. So I'm going to put these guys on an angle. So all of our different screens here, we're going to do the same. We're going to do 45, 45, 45, and the last one's already on 45. So let's hit return, and there we go. So my dots, you can see now, this is what a halftone paper looks like, right? Lots of little dots. They're on a 45-degree angle, which is what we wanted. But those dots maybe are a little bit big, so I'm going to undo that. I'm going to go back into it. And I'm going to say, actually, you know what? Give me dots that are 6 pixels wide. you know what, maybe I want 5. Again, there's a little bit of trial and error here. And again, it depends on the file size because this is a relatively small file. 8 pixels is massive. If you're working at sort of A3, A2, 8 pixels is going to be tiny, so you're going to want to boost that value up. And then effectively what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this layer on multiply, so all the white's going to disappear and only my black dots are going to remain. And then I'm going to turn that layer back on. The only issue that I've got now is I'm going to have to repaint all that stuff. So layer masks and that work in a slightly different way because this is actually an old-fashioned layer. It's actually going everywhere. But because what I did last week, I actually had a layer mask that I created in order to paint all my colors. And if you missed that step, you'll find this in the second part of the creative challenges. But that layer mask is now affecting everything underneath there, so I don't actually have to do it. So again, that's a piece of work that I've done before that's going to allow me to replicate that and reuse it, right? So then I've got my mask and I've got that working for me that way. So it just gives it a little bit more texture. It's a slightly more interesting way of doing our shading, depending again on the effect that you're going for. Same kind of idea. We're using adjustment layers, we're using layer masks, we're using our lasso tool and brushes, determining where the light's coming from. The beauty of this is that then obviously all the colors are going to stay the same underneath it. If we're trying to do a shadow that's not black, so we've kind of looked at this and say, we don't want black as a shadow. This is a little bit different though, because it's not actually putting a black on top of it. It's a halftone paper, so it creates a different effect. But let's just say for the sake of argument that you didn't want those dots to be black. You wanted them to be another color. We can do this, but we're going to have to hack a little bit here. So I'm going to take this off of multiply because I could theoretically go into my hue saturation panel, go into colorize, boost the lighting, and there we go. So I'm actually changing the color of those, but because it's on multiply, it's multiplying with the layers underneath. It's no bueno. So what I need to do is I need to put this on normal. And this is where it's going to need to hack a little bit. I've got a very low res file here. Ideally, if you're going to do this, you want a higher resolution file than I've got because you want those dots to be made up of more pixels than what I've got here. So if I zoom in close enough, you can see the pixels there, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to select one of those dots, and you can see that it's kind of done it in a weird way. So maybe I need to select the white, and again, same thing, right click, similar, maybe kind of good enough, and then I can just hit delete. So I've just gotten rid of the white here, but again, because I've got a low res file, it hasn't done a very good job of it. And so I'm getting much thicker dots than I would have liked, right? But in theory, this is the process that you would go for, right? You'd select everything, get rid of it, and then make sure that whatever's left is nice and pure black. So we got that. Okay, and then I can go in here and have much more control over the colors that will create that shading, because that is no longer on a multiply layer, it's just a normal layer. Okay, so again, just to recap, what we've looked at is basic kind of shading tutorial, how to create your shadows. We've looked at a little bit of color theory. We've looked at layer mask. We've looked at kind of creating a halftone paper to give it a little bit more texture. And we looked at using groups so that you can control what you're doing a little bit better and not have to redo the work unnecessarily, right? So that's the whole kind of 3-step process to this artwork. So we started with something like this, which was just scanned straight out of my sketchbook. You can see there's marker traces all over this. It's no good. I didn't go to the edge of the page because that's actually the edge of my sketchbook. We fixed it all up to get it nice and clean to be ready for color, and then we've got the final version in full color working for us. Okay, so thanks for tuning in, guys. Thanks for asking a few questions as well. if you followed along, next week, make sure that you guys submit this. Myself and Flynn Tracy will go through these with you guys. I'll give you guys some feedback and some pointers on where you could use the program to go a little bit better. What we'd also love as well is if you want to, send us a link to your Behance portfolios. And again, myself and Flynn will go through those and give you guys a little bit of feedback. I know that might sound a little bit daunting, but these things are really for your benefit. So please join in and we can give you guys some feedback next week. Now, we've got Kerry McElroy as well coming up in about half an hour. So stay tuned if you're in with that. She's going to go through some pretty awesome photography process. So yeah, thanks guys, and thanks for tuning in.